Okay, Glynn Harrison is Emeritus Professor now of Psychiatry in Bristol. He's also a practicing consultant psychiatrist, and his main research areas in his career have been schizophrenia and psychotic illnesses related to that, and also health service evaluation and I can never say these things, epidemiology, is that right? Which I'm not quite sure what it is, I'm afraid, but you could tell us, I'm sure. There's an admission from a geologist. So he's passionate about his work, but he's also a Christian, and he's written a book more recently, which has come out quite recently, called The Big Ego Trip, and I imagine we're going to hear about some of the things in that book, or some of the topics he covers tonight will be in that book. And I'm sure there are copies for sale at the back. There will be a reception afterwards up in the room at the back, to which you're welcome to have a drink, talk to Glynn Harrison or others, and there'll be a bookstall up there as well. Okay, so that's plenty enough from me. As you can see, his talk tonight will be Identity, Self-Esteem and the Image of God. We're working him quite hard because he had a full room of 130 sixth formers and secondary school children this afternoon, so I expect he's expecting a much more gentle audience now. Yeah. So over to you.
Well, the very first time my wife and I, one of the glories of being emeritus, I was telling the sixth formers, it just means retired. And the glories of being emeritus is that one can get around a little, and for the very first time, my wife and I went up the Acropolis last October to visit the Parthenon, and the Parthenon wasn't the only thing we came across for the very first time. We came across one of these. You know what this is? It's a selfie stick. And you notice people with these selfie sticks all over the place, putting themselves right into the centre of the picture. Now, at one level, you know, what's wrong? My wife and I just used the low-tech approach. We stopped somebody, trusted them with our expensive iPhone 6 camera, and hoped that they wouldn't beat it as we put ourselves into the picture. So at one level, this is simply a piece of technology which assists the sort of thing we all want to do, which is to be seen at the site. And yet, wandering around, I couldn't but be concerned that putting ourselves at the centre of the picture, as we see here, was symptomatic of a broader cultural narrative that's been underway for several decades now. And we see concern about this broader narrative in cartoons such as this. This is the selfie wedding, where everybody is taking pictures of themselves, and once we get to the altar, the selfie kissing the bride, and of course this rather iconic picture by the Bristol artist Banksy, in which his concern is that we are so absorbed in discovering ourselves that we are missing each other. And we have an interesting phenomenon underway in which the self is being promoted as the very centre of our culture. Somebody, I noticed on Twitter, christened the selfie stick the wand of Narcissus. And they said, that's what we should call it. And it was tweeted 2,000 or 3,000 times straight away, which again suggests that there's a growing sense of discomfort about some of these phenomena, that there are cultural changes underway in the way human beings think about themselves, view themselves, and these changes may not be altogether healthy. And that is the question that I want to put before you this evening. In fact, I'm going to make three provocative statements, or defend three provocative assertions. The first, that we have witnessed over the past half-century a cultural revolution which has been marked by the pursuit of self-worth, of which the selfie stick is the latest outcropping. Second, that this cultural revolution has been uncoupled from any scientific evidence it has little benefit and may indeed be harmful, and that human flourishing, I suggest, depends on a thicker sense of self, marked by meaning and purpose. So I'm going to try and unpack each of those three assertions. I probably won't be allowed to stop halfway through to take questions. Yes, sometimes just to receive some of your wisdom or thoughts or pushback on any of these may be quite interesting thoughts. So let's, cultural revolution. You know, I was thinking to the sixth formers, when I was sitting where they were, nearly 50 years ago, if somebody complained of feeling down or felt that nobody liked them, that they were no good, don't like myself, a friend would probably say, don't get stuck in your own problems, don't think about yourself so much. Look, instead of being a here I am person, self-absorbed, try being a there you are person. You need to look beyond yourself. You need a goal that's bigger than you. You'll never get anywhere by contemplating your own navel. Today, 50 years later, the same friend would offer radically different advice. Believe in yourself. Stop thinking so much about other people. Get your boundaries in place. You need to discover who you are. Learn to love yourself. Come on, you'd say. Say it. Don't be literally. Say it with me. I love me. I am powerful, unlimited, strong. I attract positive people and events into my life now. And if you're a religious turn of mind to God, I'm big stuff. One North American study, it wasn't a large study, carried out at the University of Ontario, it was among students, found that of those surveyed, over 50% said they used positive self-statements like this at least 50% of the time, and only 3% of people said they never use statements like this to boost their sense of self-worth. I am special. Danger, princess on board. And of course we're not surprised one bit in our popular culture, if you'll bear with me whilst I just look at some of these cultural impressions. When Whitney Houston, who tragically died not too long ago, in one of her songs that many of the young people know, of course nobody here will know at all, she asked in one of her songs, what is the greatest love of all? Of course the answer was, learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all, the primacy of self-love. Now let's look at one or two pieces of data to see if we can unpack this a little more. Many of you will have seen this. These are these kind of things, Google Ngrams, and these are Ngram viewers. Google Books Ngram viewer. They graph the proportional occurrence of a particular word in a corpus of books over the last 200 years. Very rough and ready. But they give some interesting snapshots on culture insofar as it's reflected in the frequency of word use in this corpus of books. And you can see that here we have, between the year 1800 and 2000, the proportional occurrence amongst those books of the word self-control. And it's rather interesting that we see the notion of self-control increasing through the Dickensian period, through the Victorian period, through up until the end of the First World War, and then we reach a turning point in which our interest in this notion begins to fall again, and it flattens out in the 1960s. Now, William James, who's sometimes called the father of modern psychology, he was the man who first coined the term self-esteem in, it was about 1890, something like that. But the term didn't really catch on until around about 1950, when, as we see, you might hypothesize loosely that as self-control became less of interest, self-esteem certainly grew in interest and filled that cultural hole, that cultural gap. And this is quite a massive explosion of interest in this concept of self-esteem. These are articles extracted from a psychoinfo database by Tweng and Campbell, published in their book on narcissism. And these are the number of articles in psychology and related fields on self-esteem. And you can see that this cultural interest in self-esteem is being driven by by scientific endeavour, into scientific psychology in the academy, of research into self-esteem. This is, in fact, not just plateaued, it's falling quite significantly at the moment. But we can see that accompanying the general cultural interest, we have this research interest in this area. And in terms of translation into popular culture, we see a similar marked growth of publications in major news outlets on self-esteem. And I have a little Google alert on self-esteem, and every day into my in-tray tumble articles that Google picks up on self-esteem. And there are always 8, 9, 10 a day about self-esteem producing this effect, this being bad for your self-esteem, this being good for your self-esteem, and so on. It is a very, very common cultural word. Here we have American students who rate their abilities above average. And again, this is from Tweng and Campbell. And Tweng gathered together large numbers of data sets. She did an incredible amount of data collection. And from various surveys, she was able to show over time that the proportion rating themselves as above average is gradually increasing. And we see here intellectual self-confidence. In 1965, 40% of students in these surveys rated themselves as above average in intellectual self-confidence. By 2010, 60% said I'm above average. You have to be a mathematician to see that there's a bit of a problem there. As in leadership ability, similarly we have this increase, which again, can't prove this to be the case, but it seems to be consistent with the notion that views about ourselves, evaluation of ourselves, have been shifting and changing over the past few decades. This is the narcissism personality inventory, and it's in its shortened form, it's a fairly quick and dirty, but generally valid measure of narcissistic personality traits that's been widely used once again in surveys of American students. Now, narcissism refers to a cluster of personality traits which include a sense of superiority, grandiosity, self-absorption, exhibitionism, entitlement, and exploitativeness. And the most commonly used instrument for measuring these personality characteristics is the NPI. It's a measure of the subclinical manifestation. It isn't really making any sort of diagnosis of personality disorder. But Tweng and colleagues, once again, Jennifer Tweng, was pulled together several data sets where the NPI had been used, made adjustments for variations, say gender and ethnicity, although one may want to question some of those adjustments. And she suggests that once again we see, although I'm sure you would say you should never have a graph that doesn't show down to zero, but there we are. We can see a general rise in the score of the NPI in college students over this period, which, once again, I can't prove that this is related to the self-esteem movement, but I just, at the moment, raise it as an interesting observation that's consistent with this ongoing cultural shift of attitudes toward the self. And if one puts statistical trend tests on this, this is certainly a significant trend. Just to give you a little more idea of the NPI offers a choice between two statements. I have a natural talent for influencing people, Or, I am not good at influencing people. Which of those would you choose? The thought of ruling the world frightens the heck out of me. Or, if I ruled the world, it would be a better place. I can usually talk my way out of anything. Or, I try to accept the consequences of my behaviour. It's interesting that we're seeing scores of narcissism increasing over this period when one looks at some of those endorsements, some of those measures, statements being endorsed. So what's this all about? What might be going on? What might lie behind these changes of attitude toward the self? And I want to identify 6 potential factors. Possibly more, but here are 6. First, the identification of the potential pathological impact of negative self-evaluation in many of the psychotherapeutic theories developed in the first half of the 20th century was certainly a factor. In other words, Freud's notion of the importance of positive self-regard in protecting the ego from the destructive power of the superego, Adler's inferiority complex, Horner's notion of the shrinking self, Carl Rogers' notion of the primacy of self-acceptance, even Bowlby's work on attachment. In the 50s and 60s, people, as they surveyed the landscape of huge numbers of competing counselling and psychotherapeutic models, asked themselves whether there was a common ingredient to them all. What if the crucial ingredient for human flourishing, being identified by these different models, were to be a positive sense of self-worth? What if that's the common factor shared by these competing different models? Now, Bowlby, for example, despised the self-esteem movement. He resented the way that self-esteem movement extracted his notions of the development of self and competency and boundaries of the self and shriveled it down and collapsed it down to this simplistic notion of self-worth. But as my first suggestion for what was going on, I suggest that this was indeed the case. That we identified amongst the models a common factor for human flourishing. That was positive self-worth. Second, emerging empirical data which showed a correlation between low self-worth and a whole range of adverse psychological outcomes. And you can sense the excitement in academia as these correlations were uncovered between low self-worth and a range of mental health issues. Depression, certainly. Panic disorder, yes. Eating disorders, a number of personality disorders. In the 60s, 70s, range of papers published showing a correlation between these different mental health issues and low self-worth. But not simply mental health, academic achievements, a great deal of excitement in the educational establishment, but low self-worth appeared to correlate with poor educational outcomes. Crime, social deviance, substance misuse. Again, what if the common ingredient, what if the common pathological factor in all of these were to be low self-worth? Second. And third, the error that correlation equals causation. That was the third factor that lies behind this cultural phenomena, this cultural shift that we're talking about. But one can see how the bias, the seduction here, that correlation may be causation. Because if that were the case, then truly we've stumbled on the holy grail of human flourishing. You just need to feel better about yourself. In fact, even as it rolls off the tongue, it has a certain track to it. You just need to feel good about yourself. Fourth, the theoretical development in the 60s particularly associated with the work of Carl Rogers, but many others, of the concept of non-contingency. This is the notion of self-esteem, concept that independent of character, achievements, status, other people's assessments, context, the self is capable of asserting its own worth, non-contingently, independently. So you need to stop staking your sense of worth on what other people say. You need to stop staking your sense of worth on your latest achievement, because we know that our achievements are successful, fail. Stop, and you assert your own worth. You say what you're worth, non-contingency. And again, the simplicity of this, you just need to love yourself, is deeply compelling and deeply seductive. And that leads to our fifth factor, which is the uncoupling of the implementation of these provisional research findings from the evidence base in public policy, public health policy, and education policy. The excitement was just too much there. We had to get on. If you just need to love yourself, that's all that's needed, then this needs to be implemented. And what we saw, usually one of my research areas was evidence into practice. How do we get health services to implement the research, the evidence that we uncover? Self-esteem is a wonderful example of the opposite of this, where public implementation leapt ahead of the evidence base on the basis of correlation equals causation. And we had a massive implementation, particularly in education, but in other areas too, of what the positive psychologist Martin Seligman, who many of you will hear of, despisingly called boosterism, the notion that if feeling bad about yourself is the problem, then boosting your self-worth must be the solution. You assert what your worth is. And then finally, before I say finally, we had the birth, certainly in the 1987 in California, the concept of the social vaccine, that you catch them young and you sell it hard. And if this really is the holy grail, that to boost sense of self-worth, then this is something we need to introduce as early as possible into the developmental trajectory of our children, with the promise of better mental health, better social outcomes. Do you know, the governor of California who introduced it, he said, I think people are even going to pay their taxes better. You see, self-esteem even makes you pay your taxes. So there you are. What was the reason than that? 6, a highly fertile and receptive cultural environment marked by Western individualism and the sexual revolution of the 60s. This was the final factor that gave lift-off to the self-esteem movement and the cultural changes that we're talking about here. Basically, these early provisional findings, flawed in many ways from academia on self-esteem, were able to forge a powerful alliance with popular culture. If you remember, the 60s were about Western individualism and the sexual revolution. They were about the casting off of old restraints, traditions, the straitjacketing of our previous cultural mores, and doing your own thing. This is a picture, just to illustrate this, of Listen with Mother. Remember Listen with Mother? And here we have the family radio with the family gathered round listening with Mother. Now, one of the great icons of the 60s, of course, was the transistor radio. You didn't have to listen with Mother anymore. You could go down the street with the radio on your ear, and you listen to it. And of course, this has been taken to its natural extension now as we we go around the world oblivious to everything with our earphones in individualism. And of course, much of this was driven economically too. I remember as a 60s teenager myself, money, we were making money, and much of that new money was coming into the pockets of young people. I was from a very working class family. When I failed some of my early exams, I remember my grandmother saying, look, Glynn, I really want to be a doctor, but look, our kind of people don't do things like that. But I was a 60s kid. I thought, no, we do things like that. This is a time for being ourselves. So I'm not saying that all of this is negative. There were some wonderfully liberating developments at this time. But this was the culture, the individualism, that provides such a fertile, receptive ground for boosterism. In fact, we see a remarkable synergy, a tipping point almost, between culture and science, in which Western individualism is baptized by science, it seems. They forge a powerful alliance in keeping going this revolution. And so the individualism of the 60s mutates effortlessly in the let it all hang out of the 70s, the me generation, Tom Wolfe, as he characterized it, which mutates even more effortlessly into the greed is good of Gordon Gekko of the 80s and yuppies. The self is now in control. The self is in the ascendancy. This is about what makes me feel good, because that is the secret to human flourishing. So that's my first assertion. And I'd like to stop for a moment because I'd love some of your comeback, maybe pushback or reflections. Yes, please.
Just in relation to the...
Can you use the microphone?
Sorry, yeah, of course.
Maybe just say who you are.
Hi, my name's Darren. Just in relation to the data that you presented there from the student studies, and in relation to this whole proclamation of the self, it's one thing to say that you are brilliant, but it's quite another thing to believe it. And I've often, in fact I still do, when I open my Facebook page, I take this as a profound symptom of insecurity, if anything. So yeah, just a comment.
That's a great comment. Do you know, I was particularly pleased that the sixth one was one of those picked this up too, that all we are doing is measuring self-report here. We're simply measuring the way in which people are willing to speak of themselves to strangers who come with check signature, or to speak of themselves to forms that they put on their desks. So you're absolutely right, we may not actually be witnessing real substantive changes in our inner life, in our imaginative selves, in our inner self, our sense of self. That may well be the case. People talk about fragile self-esteem, the notion that the more you talk yourself up, the more that this is evidence of a fragility inside. And that may be the case. The only problem is we don't know. and I'm reminded of Freudianism. The problem with Freudianism is that the analyst can always tell you why you are resisting his insights, you see, because he can see behind your protestations. And so I'm always a little wary when we say, of course, behind the data we know what's really going on. I absolutely accept what you say. It may be that all we're measuring is changes, not actually the way we view ourselves, but the way we've been trained to present ourselves. And that's a very viable observation. No, thank you. Yes. Any other sort of wisdom, thoughts? Should we carry on then? Let's ask whether this has been a benefit. My assertion is this has been a little benefit and may indeed be harmful. What's the evidence for this? Well, one of the key people here is Boyd Blaumeisser. He was a prolific researcher in self-esteem in the early 90s who became increasingly disillusioned. And eventually the American Psychological Association said, in view of the increasing controversy in this area, particularly about the effectiveness of boosterism, that stands as one of the substantive contributions to the literature. In this country, Nicholas Emler from the LSE at the same time produced a similar review for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and came up with remarkably similar findings. And Jennifer Twain, more recently, has produced vast data sets which have tracked our self-evaluations over time, some of which I've shown. These three authors and others principally conclude that there really is very little hard evidence that self-esteem is a critical causal factor in this range of adverse outcomes that I talked about before, whether it's mental health, whether it's substance misuse, whether it's, say, risky sexual behavior. The conclusion of all three authors and others is that it's really hard to find good evidence that low self-esteem is a causal factor. I mean, for example, this paper from the Dunedin birth cohort. If you were born in Dunedin, was it 1980? Anyway, it's one of the most wonderful birth cohorts because they've tracked them very carefully. And every year, if you were born in that year, one of those 1,000 babies, you have a raft of, you have a whole raft of measures carried out on you. It's one of the very good birth cohorts. It's wonderful in terms of its depth. As you can see, its width, its numbers are a bit challenging. It's only got 1,000 in it. That's always the trade-off, isn't it, in these kind of studies. But the Dunedin birth cohort found a significant association between risky sexual behaviours, such as sexual behaviour likely to expose one to STDs or to unwanted pregnancies, between risky sexual behaviours and earlier measures of low self-esteem taken at age 11. This was a significant association. However, when they controlled for social class, sexual abuse, IQ and family stability, the association was lost. In other words, this was a confounding factor, and if we want to really look more realistically into the roots of risky sexual behaviours, we need to look at social class, sexual abuse, IQ and family stability as key factors. That doesn't mean, because of the complexities here, that self-esteem may not be on the causal pathway, but to identify it as a significant causal agent is difficult in this particular data set, and in many others. Now, I should add that more recently, there have been, I think, 2 or 3 rather good papers which have challenged these findings and suggested that low self-worth measured earlier in life, in early teenagehood, may have a causal contribution to make to later adverse events, particularly some mental health outcomes. Even there, any of you that have experience in playing with large data sets know that this is a complex area and large pinches of salt are required to be kept at hand. But there have now been 2 or 3 papers. I think the jury's out, but at best the contribution is small, and quite where on any causal pathway it fits is still hard to discern. But basically, Blaumeister and Nicholas Emler in this country put a big question mark over the weight that we've given to low self-esteem as a causal factor over the previous few decades. They also came up with the notion that they could find no evidence that self-praise delivers the health, educational, or social outcomes claimed. They looked at education, they looked at some of the social factors, the substance misuse, criminality, and so on. They looked at all of the trials which have exposed vulnerable individuals to boosterism, to increasing their self-worth, and they could really identify no trials that substantively produced evidence of an effect here. And there really is very little evidence that these programs to boost self-esteem work. let me describe this one. This is from the University of Ontario, Waterloo, and Wood, Dr. Wood and her colleagues carried out a rather nice study in which they randomized a group of subjects to one of three conditions. Okay. In the first group, they were given a pack of cards, such that, for example, today you could download from the American Self-Esteem Association a pack of cards with positive self-statements. I am confident in myself. I am special. I influence people. I impact events. Those kind of statements. And they asked the first group to focus positively on them for 20 minutes a day. The next group, they asked to meditate on these statements and ask themselves, how is this true and not true of me? In other words, it was a more evaluative condition. The third group were told to do nothing at all, just give them. What was the outcome? Well, this is the group I just want to comment on. What they found was that the group that were given the positive self-statements, those at the beginning of the study who had reasonably good measures of self-worth, self-esteem, rated by the most common inventory that's used, they felt a little better even at the end after using these cards. So if you're feeling good about yourself, it is possible to boost it up a little. It felt a little better. There were no measurable health benefits on any of the other measures, but they actually subjectively felt a little better. The problem was the people at the beginning of the study who went into this group with low self-esteem, by the end actually felt worse than before they got it. And the authors conclude that positive self-statements may benefit some, but, quote, backfire for the people who need them most. Why? Because it's hard to believe your own propaganda, especially if you've got low self-esteem, which sort of identifies the loneliness of this journey into which people are called of self-definition, defining their own worth simply for being themselves, praising the self for being itself, and some of the difficulties that this has produced. Well, not only does it not work, but it appears that there are a number of costs of self-esteem. The costs of the pursuit of self-esteem, not costs of self-esteem, costs of the pursuit of self-esteem, the costs of making this the main road, the organizing principle of mental life, of making this what some psychologists call a superordinate goal of life. The goal of my life is self-fulfillment. It is to feel better about myself, to feel good about myself. One makes that the superordinate goal, the big goal of one's life. The main researcher here is Jennifer Crocker in the States. She's done a lot at the University of Ohio. She's done a lot of very interesting research. And she identifies individuals for whom the maintenance of self-worth is a key value. It's a key pursuit. And she's investigated them in a number of ways. And she's found, first of all, that the pursuit of self-esteem, rather than diminishing contingency, which is what it's supposed to do, I decide what I'm worth, increases it. It increases a sense of anxiety about what I'm worth and intensifies the pursuit of indicators of my worth. And why might that be? Going back to, because it's hard to believe your own propaganda. Every time you make the assertion, I am a worthwhile person, you pose the question, but by how much? And you raise the query in comparison with whom? And what Jennifer Crocker does in a number of her studies, which shows that people whose sense of self-esteem is threatened become increasingly anxious and involve themselves in behaviours aimed at reasserting their self-esteem, of re-earning their self-esteem. So paradoxically, self-worth, boosting self-worth, which is supposed to reduce contingency, Crocker says intensifies it. Just a little picture of contingency. Who's this? Johnny Wilkins. November 2002, 26 seconds before the end of the match, that famous drop goal which won the World Cup for England. And this should have been the moment, everything that little boy, when he was 8, first went onto the field, dreamed of being. And yet in his book, Tackling Life, if you remember, he became a national treasure for a little while. He was carried through the streets of London on the top of Johnny Wilkinson, he won. And he says in his book, Tackling Life, and yet, he says, within hours of that kick, not days, not months, within hours of that kick, I was tumbling out of control. You see, I'm only as good as my last kick. I've been afflicted with a powerful fear of failure, and I didn't know how to free myself from it. You see, he said, I'm only as good as my last kick. And this is contingency. This is the staking of one's self-worth on an achievement. It's everything that pursuit of self-esteem is designed to deliver us from, and yet intensifies our absorption with. Only as good as our last kick. Crocker also suggests that it reduces empathy, because, and I won't describe anything more about this for time's sake, simply because if I'm so preoccupied with the maintenance of my own self-worth, I don't have time for you. And a number of quite elegant experimental situations in which she threatens people's sense of self-worth, and then they have to listen to stories, quite heart-rending stories from actors, and she discovers that those with this threatening sense of self-worth just don't pay the actor, and they can't involve themselves because they are preoccupied with what has just happened. But more interestingly, I just want to move on to the impairment of learning and growth. Now, in many ways, you may want to raise with me a little later, well, what do you mean by human flourishing? And I'd suggest that we can have a long philosophical discussion about that, but it certainly includes a sense of non-contingency, doesn't it? We would all want not to be enslaved to other people's expectations, to other people's evaluations of us. All of us would want a sense of inner story, a sense of self, which is capable of transcending other people's expectations and deciding what we want, what our choices are. So human flourishing is something about agency and confidence in one's ability to choose what's right and good for one. It's certainly about empathy, isn't it? Something about having feeling for other people as well as oneself. And it's certainly about learning and growth, wanting to know about the world, wanting to discover about the world. The sense that one can make a difference, that one makes a mistake, taking on the chin. And then you bounce back and you try it again because you're part of something bigger than you, the antithesis of narcissism. You are serving a cause greater than yourself. Those, surely human flourishing would include those aspects of our human experience. Well, the evidence from Crocker's work is that when we make the pursuit of self-worth the main road, the organizing principle of mental life, when it's elevated in a culture to the extent that it has become over the past few decades, then there are costs to learning and growth. And basically, the pursuit of self-esteem demotivates learning. Let me illustrate what I mean. You see, it's very hard, if you think you're a prince, to discover that you're a frog, isn't it? But might turn out that I'm not a prince after all. I become risk averse. I become learning. I don't want to expose myself to situations in which I may be embarrassed. I prefer to preserve my sense of status. We were skiing a few years back, and this was a group of us who ski at the end of a schizophrenia conference, which tends to be very well placed in the Alps. And we take 2 or 3 days at the end, and we're about the same level, all sort of basic, intermediate. We're not very threatening to each other. We have a good time together. We're not really as good as this by any means. But one day, we were standing, just catching our breath, and a group of skiers came down through the off-piste, and they looked very professional. They had helmets before. I mean, everybody has helmets now, but they had helmets like 10 years ago. And so they were obviously very keen, very skilled. And they stopped by us, and I spotted a friend of mine in the group from the conference. And he said to me, Glynn, he said, come join us. And I thought for a microsecond, he said, because we're going off piste and we've got a guide. You see. And I thought for a microsecond, I said, no, thank you very much. But, have a great time. And off they went, swished down through the off-piste. And one of the people in our group, a pathologist, can you believe? Pathologist. He said, it's interesting, guys, isn't it? He said, Glynn would rather be the best in this group than the average in that. That, in a way, is the essence of what I'm trying to say here. When we think we're special, it's hard to take risks that may expose that is not the case. Now, what Carol Dweck has done, and those of you who are teachers will know of her work, it's quite well respected. She compares different kinds of praise. And the question is, how should you praise your kids? And here's the wrong way. Praise that induces a fixed mindset. You're smart. You're special. Hey, what do we have here? A Mozart in the making or what? Those kind of statements which set a child apart from others, which give them a sense of standing above others. You're intelligent. A fixed mindset, as she calls it, makes us want guaranteed success and leads to the avoidance of effort. On the other hand, praise that encourages effort, you really worked hard at that, well done, induces what she calls a growth mindset that responds positively to risk of failure. Now, she illustrates this, for example, by an experimental procedure in which she gives a group of children, usually between 8 and 11, a very easy task. They don't know it's that easy, but it's an easy task. Most do very well. And then she divides them into 2 at the end. Group A, she praises in condition A here. You're smart. You did really well at that. You must be very intelligent. Something special about you. Just the easy way you did it. You stand out a little bit. Those kind of praise approaches. And the other group were, I love the way you worked at that. Look, this isn't quite right, but I like the way you tried again. And I think if we do it together again, we'll be able to get this right. But I love your effort. I love your persistence. I like the way you take it on the chin and the back. Those kind of, it's a very different way of praising. So what she did was she praised the children, a group of co-workers praised the children, these 2 different ways. And then the children were offered a choice of test, and a choice of difficulty of test. And of course, as you can see where I'm going with this, the children in Group A, on average, and statistically significantly so, chose the easier tasks. Because they've been induced into a fixed mindset, which has made them risk averse. And Carol Dweck, and I really recommend some of her book, Mindset, is one that's particularly easy to read, very accessible, has said some very wise things about how we praise and the dangers of praise, which simply praises us for being notes in some of her individual experimental work of a tendency to induce narcissistic attitudes and responses, which we see in these larger data sets from Twain. Now, I'm not going to make the mistake of saying correlation equals causation. I can't prove that the self-esteem movement and much of what I've talked about is caused this. All I can do is point out its consistency with it. So, that's my second assertion, that this isn't adding to human flourishing. Indeed, these 6 factors which led to the growth of the self-esteem movement may be impairing, diminishing, even harming our human flourishing. I'm going to stop again before I finish on my third section. Would you like to chip in? Any thoughts, comments, pushback? Yes, just here.
On the point of impaired learning and growth, do you think another contributing factor is that if you're taught to always reinforce and be thinking positive thoughts, then that very much discourages reflection, and therefore a significant part of the learning process, which is essentially looking at what you've done, looking at how it can be improved, essentially just gets completely eliminated from the equation because it's not something you can even consider in the mindset you're taught.
Yeah, I think that's anybody else want to pick up on that point? Anybody, anything to add to? Because yes, I think, see what would, as I'm going to go on to say, nobody's arguing here for bringing up our kids with no confidence and telling them they're no good and that they're not worth anything. This isn't what I'm here to suggest. This is about how we organise our mental life and the priorities of mental life, and particularly the goal we set for ourselves. And my fundamental point is that our culture has seduced our kids and ourselves into making self-fulfillment the main line of mental life. And I think your point is that this does crowd out other reflection. And that's precisely the issue. Yes, please.
Just to follow up, Thank you. Yeah, just to follow on, I just wondered what you thought about a different use of self, really, which is self-compassion, which, you know, some psychologists now, like Kristen Neff and Paul Gilbert, focus on rather than self-esteem, where the issue is, it's not the self per se, but it's actually, self-compassion is about kindness to yourself, particularly when you fail. So it could be that the problem is, you know, self-esteem, trying to inflate a sense of worth can lead to things like narcissism and so on, but actually, you know, the problem could just be, it's more people who do a lot of attacking of themselves, and so cultivating self-compassion may be a good thing, which is actually a different dimension of self-esteem, because it's whether you're kind to yourself in a non-contingent way or when you fail, rather than attempting to inflate self-worth.
Yes, I think that's a great point. In my book, I have a chapter on, my book is, just as a helpful warning, has a very strong religious second half, so just, if that might give someone a panic attack, don't buy it. But there is you know, I have a chapter of self-compassion because I think it's a very, very helpful comment. Of course, the Old Testament says that, you know, God is a father who is compassionate to his children, for he knows that we are dust. And the notion of self-compassion for religious believers takes the lead, the cue from God and his approach to us. He knows that we are dust. He knows that we struggle. He knows that some of us have to travel along much further than others to get to the same point. And so go easy on yourself sometimes. Give yourself a break. Of course, C.S. Lewis encapsulated this wonderfully in, I think it's toward the end of Mere Christianity, where he says, you know, if you're a poor creature who struggled with an inferiority complex or a sexual sort of issue, he says, go easy, give yourself and he doesn't put it like this, give yourself a break because you're driving a broken down machine. This car is giving you a bumpy ride. It's an old banger, he says. But then, of course, using within his own religious belief system, he says, but one day, of course, not in this life, but another time, you may surprise us all because you learned you were driving in a hard school. And that has a wonderful sense of compassion about it. Without excusing the self, it has a sense of redemption and also telos. It's saying to the self, yes, be compassionate, but keep aiming for something better. But yeah, I think self-compassion has come up the fast lane as a much more healthy, rounded way of approaching our negative self-feelings than self-esteem. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yes, point over there.
Hi, very nice. Just a question. I wondered if you could say something about locus of control and self-esteem.
Would you like to say so? Never ask a psychiatrist. So. Yeah, I think you just give me an idea where you're coming from on that.
Just that people who feel in control of their lives and can make a difference to their environment,
Yes.
compared to people that don't feel in control of their lives and don't feel they can make a difference to their environment, and how that links with self-esteem.
Yes. There are certainly, there's quite a bit of data which suggests an association between self-esteem, because of course self-esteem, well, one of the problems with self-esteem, you'll notice I carefully avoided the definition. And that's because academia itself struggles with the definition of this thing. It's the most extraordinary. One of the most extraordinary aspects of this whole debate, actually, if you look at the the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, who wrote that? Can anyone help me out with a blank? One of the founding fathers of the self-esteem movement, who wrote the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, whose name will slide back into my failing brain, hopefully soon. He blogged in 2008. He wrote his book in '69. It was one of the great books. I can tell you at that time he was partnered with Ayn Rand, so I can remember all the context, but not the name. It was a very substantial piece of work. And he blogged in 2008. The project is still in the whole self-esteem endeavour, is to agree a definition. And I think that's still some way off. So I think that is leading many people to say, look, we need to the self-esteem lens has probably had its day in terms of being helpful in thinking about human flourishing. That's why self-compassion, people are saying this is a much better lens through which to view this question of how we flourish as human beings. Or in schools, as you know, resilience is the current interest, although that's giving way to character. Say something about this in a moment, because of course, as you might point out, Praetorians were very resilient. Bullets have high self-esteem, but what about character and virtue? And so there are other lenses being used to look at this issue of flourishing and self-esteem. I think it's probably had its day. But I've certainly the case that those who measure high on the self-esteem movement, the scale that's most commonly used, which is, to be honest, it's a mix of statements of self-worth and statements of competency. So it's not just I'm worth, but I am able. And it's those higher scores on statements of competency and agency, a sense of agency, which therefore mean that these people also score higher on locus of self-control. So there is a relationship between those two measures.
Nathaniel Brandon.
Excuse me?
Nathaniel Brandon.
Nathaniel Brandon, thank you very much. Yes, someone's got Google there. Is that right? Yes, Nathaniel Brandon. Thank you, yes. Can we get the mic on here?
are you addressing mainly Western culture? Because I was at a talk yesterday about a group of people helping women and girls in the slums of Calcutta, and they haven't got anywhere near the starting line, and this is a huge issue for the helpers.
Yes.
To get them started by really being they can cope and do things. So
Yes.
just that quick question.
Yes, there's not been very much, self-esteem is very much a Western cultural thing. But just by the way, for example, Japanese culture works, there's been remarkably little work in this area because it's not a concept that sits well with that more corporate sense of the self. The self individually is viewed quite differently in Japan, although I'm no expert. I think one of the worst things we can do, though, in India and more recently Eastern Europe, I've travelled quite a bit in Eastern Europe, and you encounter the most harrowing stories of youngsters beaten down by cruel parents, and some of the discipline that's used. No one wants to go back to that. But I do think that it would be a great pity if we import into India and places such as that, where kids have been beaten down, the notion that the solution is to boost yourself up. It's what I'm about to call a thin, so it's too thin as a remedy to low self-worth, for the self to simply assert itself. I think we need a thicker sense of self, which I'm about to try and say something about. But that's a very good point. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
I just wondered, following on from that, whether in China it's completely different, the one-child policy might have had an effect with self-esteem.
Yes, and I'm no expert on this. I can't speak with any sense of knowledge of data, but there's certainly a lot of, and it's just talk, an impression that kids, one-person kids, are just incredibly burdened with parental expectations, isn't it?
They're all little princes and so on.
Yes.
It's a while since we saw the title for your presentation. I think it contained the words, the image of God.
Yes.
And that has to be one of the, whatever one's feelings for or against religion, Christianity, that has to be one of the, in history, one of the strongest statements for validation of self. You haven't mentioned it. The times that we are living through have attacked the concept of God, and therefore also the relationship between man and God and the validity of that statement. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I'm going to go on and in the third section and hopefully just say a little more about the notion of the image of God. And Bob's saying, get on with it. So let's do that. In order to flourish as human beings, clearly we need a sense of self, a sense of identity that allows us to engage with life's challenges confidently, that encourages us to be learners, that encourages us not to fear failure, that allows us to bounce back when things don't work out. And of course it's hard to flourish when we are preoccupied with feelings of being worthless, or no good, or incompetent. So nobody is arguing here that self-worth is not integral to human flourishing. I believe it is. But my main point is that it shouldn't be the main road. It shouldn't be the organising principle of mental life. We mustn't allow it to become the superordinate goal of our life's purpose. And so I go on to argue that we need a sense of self, a thicker sense of self, the one organised around the question, what makes me feel good? A thicker sense of self organised around a goal larger than self-fulfillment or even self-resilience. And I'd humbly submit that human flourishing requires a sense of self with at least 3 core ingredients. A sense of self. First, self-acceptance. I'm not meaning acceptance entirely in the Rogerian sense. Those of you that are familiar with Carl Rogers' work. I'm simply meaning in a more pragmatic sense that you can't reflect on what you don't accept to be there. And so self-acceptance has to be the first stage in which I flourish as a human being, to accept the person that I am and the range of experience that's there in my sense of self. And those of you that are counsellors or therapists will know that you need to spend a great deal of time helping someone accept that that is me, to bring him from the darker side of ourselves, from the repressed, the unwanted, fully into conscious awareness, the whole range of my experience of myself, and accept that that is me. That is what I am. And so self-acceptance is integral, I believe, to self-flourishing. But that second, a sense of self in which the narration of the self includes at least the possibility of redemption. Now, I don't mean that necessarily in the religious sense, but redemption which enables the self to respond to the negatives of character in a way that's able to rise above them and move beyond them and move forward. And this is, of course, what leads into the model, say, of self-compassion. Self-compassion has implicit within it the notion of redemption. That, be kind to yourself. Be ready to move on. Be ready to forgive yourself or to be forgiven. You need to grow as a person. So that's the second key ingredient of a sense of self that I think leads to human flourishing. The third is this, a narration of the self that includes superordinate goals rooted in meaning and purpose. What I've called a thicker sense of identity, in which worth is embedded in a personal sense of meaning and purpose. The moral philosopher Charles Taylor suggests that you can't evaluate the worth of a thing without knowing its purpose. Now, the ethicists here may want to debate that, but with the example that if a Martian comes from outer space and you give them a screwdriver, you say, what's that worth? And he has no idea because he doesn't know what it's for. He has no concept of its purpose. But when you show him the screws and you show him what can be done with this thing, he now understands its purpose and you begin to speak in terms of its worth. And so worth needs to be integrated within the self, with a sense of the meaning of the self, the purpose of the self, what I am here for. Now, many of you will be identifying at this point that we left the room headed empirical psychology some time ago. And we're now very firmly in a room headed philosophy of life and spirituality and worldview. And one of the, I think, the great delusions of the self-esteem movement is that it's masqueraded as science, when in fact most of the questions it raises are why questions. What am I worth? What is my value? What is my purpose? Why am I here? And those are questions that can't be answered. Why questions within the domain of empirical science. Now, if you'll forgive me to sharing my own Christian worldview, it's my worldview which I believe provides those three ingredients for human flourishing and which allows for the development of a sense of self, a sense of identity, which is thicker and redolent with purpose and meaning. And I am personally compelled by the grandeur of the vision of humans made in the image of God himself. That humans share with God creative power. One of the first commandments given to humankind in the book of Genesis is let them rule. God creates, brings into being his creation, and then at the apex of creation he brings into being man and woman made in his image. He says let them rule, make more of the creation that he brought into being, to cultivate it, to build on it, to develop it, to be creators. And this brings with it an enormous sense of purpose, to rule, to share in the rule of God, and to build his kingdom, and agency, a sense that God himself empowers and equips me to serve that purpose. And so this is a thick, a rich concept of human, which is given by the Christian faith. And of course it's a revealed view of identity. In this view of the human being, human birth, human worth does not become real when you start to believe in yourself. You had it before you started to believe in yourself, because God himself believed in you. And it remains real even when neglected or violated. It may be discerned differently in different eras, but it's not arbitrary. It's not to be socially constructed. It's not to be personally constructed. It isn't the victim, my context, my background. It is revealed. And of course this is rooted in the we have in John chapter 1, where we read that God gave the right to become children of God. Effectively, God speaks, and thus our sense of self is grounded in a reality beyond the self, non-contingent, because it isn't dependent on my assessment of myself in the will of God, or not a few will of women, but of God. As the mid-400s, Leo the Great wrote, "Christian, recognize your dignity. And now that you share in God's own nature, do not return to your former base head, and of whose body you are a member. Never forget that you have been rescued from the light, the kingdom of God." And I suggest to you that this concept, the Christian concept, of three ingredients, for I must fully accept the reality of who I am. I am the sinner, to quote Leo, that God saves. Recognize your identity. It's and of course it holds within it a purpose, a superordinate goal of joining in the very rule of God himself, building the kingdom of God. And from Leo the Great to Immanuel Kant to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this older model of worth of the individual held sway for centuries. You have dignity and worth because it was rooted in the revelation of God as to what we are as human beings. It's only in the past 50 years that we've made our sense of self-worth dependent on the self itself, and hence the loneliness of self-validation and some of the costs which we have talked about. So, to finish, this thicker sense of self is what I would argue is conveyed to us in the Christian gospel, but there are other spiritualities, there are other religions, there are other non-religious worldviews which are also capable of conveying a sense of purpose and worth, aren't there? There will be people here who would want to argue for that. I'm sure Crocker herself, she doesn't have a particular religious solution here. She argues against what she calls ego awareness, in which the self is absorbed in its own fulfillment and hence pays the price of those in empathy, loss of empathy, so on, intensified contingency. She argues for a philosophy of life which she calls eco awareness, where the self aims for a superordinate goal that's about something other than self-fulfillment, that's about serving an ecological vision that's greater than me, but in which I participate. Eco-awareness. Now, I think that is a valid philosophy of life. It's just one that doesn't entice me personally, but there are others. Humanism, Buddhism, each of these are capable of enabling the self to develop a sense of self which is thicker than the very thin ice of self-worth. So, how does one develop this sense of self, this sense of identity? I'm going to finish with this point. The Chief Government Science Advisor, Professor Sir John Beddington, wrote a Government Commission report recently and downloaded it. It's called Future Identities. And he identifies the formation of identity as one of the critical challenges for humankind in the next 10 years. And he says this: over the next 10 years, people's identities are likely to be significantly affected by several important drivers of change, in particular, rapid developments in technology, the emergence of hyperconnectivity, where people can be constantly connected online, the spread of social media, the increase in online personal information are key factors which will interact to influence identity. Now, what he's saying is that the endless possibilities that social media and hyperconnectivity offer for the reinvention of the self make it ever more difficult to develop an inner sense of self that has any security or stability or coherence. And we see this on Facebook. You know, what do you do on Facebook? You update your status. It's in a constant state of development, and you compare with other people's updates. You update yours too, and so the possibilities for self-reinvention have been vastly magnified by social media, modern technology, hyperconnectivity, and it is going to be more difficult than ever to develop an inner sense of self which is thick enough to enable us to flourish with the sense that we have something to give and something to make a difference with, a purpose that's about more than how I feel and my status right now. And whatever our religious view, our world view, I'd suggest that this is a task, a significant task, which faces humankind if we're to flourish. And very simply, I'd offer these four: stop. We need to stop, to reflect, and to imagine, to give image, to give substance, to give mental life to our concept of ourselves. For the Christian, this is the imaginary task that we have of inhabiting our identity as those made in the image of God. But I suggest to you that just reading it isn't enough. We have to inhabit this intentionally, imaginatively, the imaginary of Scripture as to who we are. And then out of that sense of self to live intentionally, and at times even non-contingently, strengthened by that inner sense of coherence, identity. So I'm going to stop there. What do we do now? Do we do some more questions at this point?
I think some people may have to slip away, so feel free to do that if you want to without embarrassment. Perhaps we'll just have a couple of minutes of questions because I know there's drinks and bookstore awaiting us, and there'll be a chance to chat more then. So ahead with those, and then we'll stop and have a drink at the back.
Thanks very much. The great. You probably need Irenaeus and his thought as the person who actually set off that train of thought, which I found valuable. Coming from from the point of view of people who don't know much about their identity, model their behaviour on the ridiculous example, perhaps, Don Quixote reading himself to be one, and that is all very innocent because nobody gets hurt. But bringing all around us at the moment, people with no identity, thinking they can find joining Al-Qaeda, joining IS, and this will give me an identity and a purpose in life way through, because I am the little prince and I am very important. Is that something that you see that you've been putting out today, and people's increasing sense in that direction?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'd love to sort of reflect on it. I'm sure that our learning during Al-Qaeda is a quick. Something like that. I actually find a sense of coherence and depth in life, a rule of life, a sense of purpose. There into which one is inducted, which I certainly, I said that it may be divided. I'm not sure it's quick. For me, the word quick is you can reinvent yourself very quickly in social media, represent yourself with your latest self, sorts of adjustments to your photograph and to your self-presentation, and there are real issues. Inventing shadow selves, alter egos, and this for some journey into another self to substitute the boredom or the But I take your point. It's certainly a this solution is an easy solution in a sense.
Shall we take one last question and then we'll adjourn? Coming behind you.
Term self-efficacy. I never understood why he coined the term self-esteem movement. He's known as the world's greatest living, America's greatest living psychologist. I actually never really understood the word self-efficacy, and I work with people to build realistic confidence. That is, that they would understand who they truly, what they are truly competent at, and then from that build purpose into their lives.
Yes, in fact, Bandura is taking, in his concept of self-efficacy, he's taking the competency aspects out of the self-esteem,
yes.
Sort of amalgam. And he's making something of that, and I think that's been more productive and less problematic, as you said. I think that's a helpful